So with that in mind, we'll turn to the Gospel of Luke, and we'll open chapter 23. And before then, I just want to give a quick summary of what happened in Luke 22 when we read about the Last Supper with Jesus and his 12 male disciples. After this supper was done, Jesus then went into the Garden of Gethsemane, and he said to his 12 disciples, "Please stay awake with me." And they said, "We're not going to do that." They fell asleep right next to him as he was praying. And while they were sleeping, he woke them up. And as soon as he woke them up, his one disciple who betrayed him, Judas, shows up and sells him out to the religious police. The religious police arrest him. And Jesus then is arrested and taken into custody. While he is there, Peter, who many people consider to be the greatest disciple, denies Jesus not one, not two, but 3 different times. And the religious people who Jesus participates in the religion with end up convicting him and deciding that he needs to go to the state officials. So he goes to the state official, which is the governor, a man named Pilate. Pilate says, "I don't want anything to do with this man. It sounds like a political nightmare." So he sends him to the puppet king, which is a man named Herod. Herod, unfortunately, is just a puppet king, so he can't do anything to Jesus. So he sends him back to Pilate. And our story unfolds when Jesus returns to Pilate for the second time. We read right here, Pilate, wanting to release Jesus, addressed the chief priests, the leaders, and the people again. Now, it's important that Luke addresses all 3 of these crowds because the chief priests are the pastors of Jesus' day. And they're the pastors of essentially what is Jesus' church. On top of that, you have the leaders, which is basically the mayor of his city. And then you have the people, which are the people who live with Jesus day in and day out in the city. So you can see these different tiers of people and how they are all pleading to Pilate, the governor, for the same thing. They are pleading with him to do something about Jesus, particularly something that is violent. We then read, a third time, Pilate said to them, "Why? What evil has he done? I have found in him no ground for the sentence of death. I will therefore have him flogged and then release him." But then the people, the chief priests, the leaders, and the people kept urgently demanding with loud shouts that Jesus should be crucified, and their voices prevailed. So Pilate, feeling overwhelmed, overrun, like he is about to lose his good standing with the people, decides that he is going to give in to them. And we read, so Pilate gave his verdict that their demand should be granted. He released the man they asked for, which was Barabbas, the one who had been put in prison for insurrection and murder. So Pilate, and then he handed Jesus over as the chief priests, the leaders, and the people demanded. So Jesus now has a cross with him, and he is going on the road up to Golgotha, and we find that the story shifts scenes to here. We said, as they lead him away, they seized a man, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming from the country, and they laid the cross on Simon and made him carry it behind Jesus. A great number of people followed them, and among them were women who were beating their breasts and waiting for him. But Jesus turned to the women and said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For the days are surely coming when they will say, 'Blessed are the barren and the wombs that never bore and the breasts that never nursed.' Then they will begin to say to the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and to the hills, 'Cover us.' For if they do this when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry?" Now, if you're confused by this, I want you to know that you're not alone. Jesus uses a lot of metaphors to say everything's going to get way worse than it is right now. And so it's better if you don't have kids. It's better if you think to yourself, oh, those mountains are going to crumble down on us any moment, because if they're acting like this right now, it's only going to get worse, which is a bit intimidating to hear from the Son of God. So then we read about what happens once they arrive at Golgotha. We read, "For 2 others also who were criminals were led away to be put to death with him. When they came to the place that is called the Skull, or Golgotha, they crucified Jesus there with the criminals, one on his right and one on his left." And we read about how Jesus then slowly begins to die. And as I read this story, it is tragic, it is sad, and there's a thought that creeps into my mind as I think about Jesus up there on the cross all by himself. It must be so hard to die alone. And I thought this for the majority of my life. But if you're like me now, you would look at this and you would say, Jesus didn't die alone. I mean, look at the picture. There are people there in the picture that are very close to Jesus. Jesus wasn't alone. There were people with Jesus at the crucifixion. In fact, we just have to go back a few verses to what I just read and read. A great number of the people followed him, and among them were women who were beating their breasts and wailing for him. So there was these women around Jesus who refused to allow Jesus to die alone. Now, it would be really nice if we knew their names and knew a little bit about them, but Luke doesn't offer us that information. However, there are 3 other gospels that do. Luke is one of 4 gospels that tells the life story of Jesus. Matthew, Mark, and John confirm Luke's account that women stayed with Jesus, and they offer names in the other 3 gospels. So if we turn to Matthew, we start to read the names of people who were there when they crucified Jesus. Now, we may not know a whole lot more about them than their name, but it's important for us to remember that these women were real people who had lives much bigger than just their name. And so we should visualize them as much as we can and recognize their life beyond the text as a way to honor them, even though we may not know much about them. So I'm going to go through each of these gospels and talk about who these women were. We're just going to share the name and give you a visual depiction, and then we'll talk a little bit more about what they were like. So let's read here in Matthew. Many women were also there, looking on from a distance. They had followed Jesus from Galilee and had provided for him. Among them were Mary Magdalene, and Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of the sons of Zebedee. So Matthew remembers these 3 women staying with Jesus as long as they possibly could until the end. We then turn to Mark's gospel, and Mark writes these words: there were also women looking from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, as well as the mother of James the younger and of Joseph, and a woman named Salome. Mark goes on to say, these used to follow him and provided for him when he was in Galilee. These women were disciples of Jesus, Mark said. He goes on to say, and there were many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem. So beyond these 3 named women in Mark's gospel, there are even more women who are there with him at the end. We then turn to John's gospel, and John's gospel was written much later than the other 3 gospels. Some people attribute it to John, other people don't. For the sake of this conversation, let's attribute it to John. We read these words: meanwhile, standing near the cross of Jesus were his mother and his auntie, and Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. These 4 women were right at the foot of the cross, according to John. And John, in his own gospel, also insists, I was totally there too, even though Mark and Matthew and Luke all say, no, John was not there. John's like, no, I was there. Trust me, I was there. I saw it. But if you look at that and you say to yourself, I don't know if John was there, and you look at these 4 different women, you realize a story is coming forward. The story is that the women are the ones who stayed with Jesus until the very end. This is depicted in a painting called I Exist by the incomparable artist Harmonia Rosales, and I find this to be deeply moving. There's something beautiful about the conglomerate of the 4 women, or the 4 gospels, who tell us the names of different women who were there, and the fact that they said, when everyone else left, these people stayed with Jesus to make sure he would never die alone. Now, to give you an idea of the magnitude of this gift, I want to tell you a story that takes me back to college. Have you ever had a song or an album just transport you back in time and you can have these visual memories of where you were before? For me, that album is called Plans by the band Death Cab for Cutie. Now, Death Cab for Cutie is led by a man named Ben Gibbard, which, once you see him, you will understand where all the inspiration for my clothes comes from. That's me. This album I absolutely love, and as soon as I hear the opening chords of the first song, Marching Bands for Manhattan, I feel like I am driving through the streets of Bozeman, Montana, on my way to class at Cheever Hall at Montana State University. None of that means anything to you here, but it means a lot to me in here. And there's one song on this album, it's track number 9, it's called What Sarah Said, and the song is set in a hospital waiting room. The song is sung from the perspective of someone whose loved one is in the ICU. And this may be a friend or a family member or a lover. We don't know, but what is very obvious is that this person cares deeply about this other person who is in the ICU. Now, what's interesting about this song is it captures the tension of all that this waiting room holds, both the optimistic hope and the unbearable agony. And the song is sung for that tension, and it just talks just so eloquently about what it's like as you receive bad news or uncertain news about what is going to happen to your loved one. And the song swells and it culminates and it gets to the thesis point where it gets really quiet, and then Ben Gibbard sings this quiet refrain when he says, "But I'm thinking of what Sarah said, that love is watching someone die." That's what love is. Now, after that, the song begins to build again, and Ben Gibbard begins to ask a question as he sings this song. He asks, "So who's gonna watch you die?" And if that wasn't emotional enough, he sings it 3 more times in a row to make sure you start answering the question. Now, I heard this song, I have memories with this song for a very long time, but I recently came across a review in the New York Times that was from 2005 when this album came out. And this review made me appreciate the album more. The review was written by a man named Khalef Hasana, and he was writing for the New York Times, and he spoke about this song specifically in his review of the album Plans. He said, "These are cruel words, you know, right? The cruel words are love is watching someone die and who's gonna watch you die. Like, these are cruel words to hear." But then he goes on to say, but Mr. Gibbard sings them as if he really wants to know, who is going to watch me die? Who is that relationship in my life? And when you look at the hospital room, you realize that while those questions and those words may not be welcome at church on a Saturday morning, when you say things like love is watching someone die and you're in a hospital waiting room, you know what that's like, right? When you start asking questions in your head like, who will be here for me if I have to go through something like this? That's a question that occurs in a hospital on a frequent basis. And I would say that the song, what Sarah said, while this isn't spoken, another question arises upon listening to it, which is, who am I willing to be there for? Who am I willing to give of my time and sit through that pain and uncertainty and that discomfort? Because if love is watching someone die, who am I willing to give that gift to? Now, when you consider the implications of this song and what it means to me, and you start to look at the story of the crucifixion through this lens, all of a sudden it becomes very apparent what these women represent and what they did. The greatest gift of love that Jesus received in his entire lifetime was from the women who stayed with him through the crucifixion. The greatest act of love, think about that. If Jesus was here and we could ask him, what was the kindest, most loving, most generous thing that has happened to you in your lifetime? I have a feeling it would say, well, these women stayed with me when it was very uncomfortable. They made sure I wasn't alone in my darkest hour. Now, this is really fascinating because when we talk about the followers of Jesus, we typically talk about these chumps. And what's really important for us to acknowledge is that none of these guys were willing to watch Jesus die. Debated by John, but none of these guys were willing to stick around. They were all scared for themselves. They were uncomfortable. They were like, you know what? I'm just going to keep my distance because I got to make sure that I protect myself. None of them wanted to hang, right? Now, what's interesting about this is the church loves to celebrate and remember these 12 dudes. They love to think about how great these apostles are, and they talk about how incredible their faith was and how much they were loving people. And yet the church turns toward these women who are recorded in all 4 Gospels, and it's this just gigantic gift of love that transcends all kinds of time and millenniums and all sorts of other things. And sadly, their extraordinary gift is often overlooked by the church. It's forgotten by the church. Because it's people like me, men, who often tell the story, and we're like, oh, they got a sentence, that's cute, and move on. This is a problem. Because we often think that the richest relationships in Jesus' life, were the relationships he shared with his disciples. But based on the evidence here, it's possible that the richest relationships in Jesus' life were with his female disciples. And that changes the entire story, doesn't it? Now, when you look at what happens here, you could say, wow, Craig, we're reading a lot into just a couple of verses, just a couple of sentences here and here from the different Gospels. Not only that, Craig, but these women don't even get to say anything in all four Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John do not record these women saying anything while the crucifixion happens. So it's hard to make a big deal out of them. Well, do you want to know why Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John don't record them saying anything? It's because none of those clowns were there. They weren't there to hear them talking. Matthew, Mark, and Luke didn't even know who Jesus was. Matthew and Mark definitely left. John was like, I was there. No, you weren't. So they were all like, oh, let me tell you about the crucifixion. And I imagine Mary Magdalene reading Mark's gospel and thinking like, you think you know what it was like? Get out of here. You have no idea how bad it was. And when you consider that, you realize, oh, there's this whole life experience that happens that is so much bigger than the text. And I love the Bible. I really enjoy studying it and talking about it, but it's important for us to take time and fill in the gaps. And up until very recently, I was very uncomfortable filling in the gaps because it felt like I was treading on, sacred ground, and I didn't want to fill in the gaps too much. This all changed when I was introduced to the work of a theologian named the Reverend Dr. Will Gaffney. She wrote a book in 2017 called the Womanist Midrash. And what she encourages in this book is to always pay attention in every Bible story to where the women and where the children are and how all of these men's actions are impacting them. Now, she says it's important to understand that the text is limited because the text is written primarily from the perspective of men. So men don't seem to care very much about what women are going through. She said, however, it's important to also honor these women by understanding that they're going through things in these stories. And so the way that Dr. Gaffney fills in the gaps is she uses a phrase that I just think is absolutely brilliant. She says, in my sanctified imagination. I love it. And she starts to tell stories about who Bathsheba was and how Bathsheba always held her head high, even though David could never look her in the eye. She starts to imagine all these female characters as strong, powerful women and what they represented that men could not see in their day and age. And while she delineates between what she imagines and what she knows is in the text, she says there is just as much inspiration in the imagination as there is in the text. And so when we talk about my sanctified imagination, it's important that we acknowledge these women's existence in the text, also acknowledge the women who were not mentioned in the text, and then we start to fill in the gaps to honor these women who gave the greatest gift of love to Jesus Christ that he ever received. Now, I could share with you my sanctified imagination, but just recently I came across the most beautiful sanctified imagination of what these women went through, and it was from a woman named Sue Monk Kidd, who wrote an excellent novel called The Book of Longings. I cannot recommend this book high enough. In this book, she imagines a woman named Anna who eventually marries Jesus. Now, in case you're wondering about where this is all going, remember, this is labeled as a novel. Just want to remind you all. Now, what's important to understand is when Sue Monk Kidd wrote this book, she imagined that if Jesus had a wife and that the church refused to acknowledge her existence, then Jesus' wife would be the most silenced woman in Christian history, which is very true. So anyway, she imagines this story, imagines the entire story of Jesus unfolding from the perspective of his wife, and it's just a beautiful telling of Jesus that I would say is very much in the category of sanctified imagination. And when we get to this story of Jesus carrying his cross toward Golgotha, there is someone, Sue Monk Kidd picks up on this idea just brilliantly. And I want to take you through the things that she imagined the women saying to Jesus as Jesus is walking toward his death. She imagines Anna, the wife of Jesus, as watching her husband suffer and yet yelling out from the crowd, "I'm here, beloved. I'm walking behind you." After a few more steps, Anna says this, "Beloved, I am still here." These words then echo into Mary, the mother of Jesus, who sees her son hurting, and she says, "My son, I am here with you also." And then there's Mary's daughter, Jesus' sister, and Anna's sister-in-law, Salome, who sees all of this going on, and she says, "And your sister walks with you as well, Jesus." Mary of Bethany jumps in and she says, "It's Mary of Bethany, Jesus. I too am here." And then Mary Magdalene, seeing Jesus suffer, stands up and says, "Jesus, it's Mary of Magdala, and I am with you." And there's a moment where Jesus stumbles and Anna catches up with him, and she begins to tell him very quickly about things that are pleasant. She says, "Jesus, remember how you taught me about the lilies and how God even cares about the least of these lilies. God still cares about you, Jesus." Eventually, this leads to the crucifixion, and Anna runs out of words because she's just so overwhelmed by the horror of what is unfolding before her. But we get to hear her thoughts, and in her thoughts, she looks at Jesus, her husband, on the cross and says, "Don't look away. Terrible things will happen now, unbearable things. Bear it anyway," she tells herself. She says, "I will think only of him. I will give him more than my presence. I will give him the full attention of my heart." After a moment, she waits, and then she thinks to herself, "That would be my parting gift to him. I would go with him to the end of his longings." And Sumunk Kid picks up on the idea that there are times that you watch loved ones go through unbearable tragedies, and sometimes the best gift you can give them is just to say, "I'm here, I'm with you, and you do not need to face this alone." These women are incredible to me. And the women who stayed are heroines of the faith, and they are champions of love. And as a church, we have to recognize that, acknowledge it, and treat them as such. Because when you talk about the cross, we got to recognize what the cross is. There is no explanation for the tragedy of the cross. It is brutal, it is violent, it is painful. There aren't ways that God can fix it. It's just a cruel reality. The cross is simply a cruel reality of Jesus Christ's human existence. And it's hard for us to explain the cross away, but it's important for us to acknowledge something. While this cross exists and it is a cruel reality, Jesus did not face the cross alone. He was not alone as he went through all of these things. Which brings us to the cross today. The great Richard Rohr once wrote these words: "There must be, and if we are honest, there always will be at least one situation in our lives that we cannot fix, control, explain, change, or even understand." He goes on to say, "For Jesus and for his followers, the crucifixion became the dramatic symbol of that necessary and absurd stumbling stone." So in other words, the cross symbolizes the human experience of a cruel reality. Have you ever experienced something you can't fix? Have you ever experienced something that you're like, normally I can take care of this, but I seem to have lost control of the situation? Have you ever received a diagnosis without a good prognosis? Have you gone through the worst that life has to offer and you're getting to the end of it and you're thinking to yourself, why did that happen? And you realize that as you ask that question over and over again, that there simply is no explanation. When you get to the point where you are experiencing suffering that doesn't have an explanation, then my friends, you are experiencing a cross moment. And this symbol reminds us that while it may seem unfair and very cruel and unkind that we have to go through this, this is exactly where God is found. And I would love to tell you tricks and tips to avoid crucifixion moments in your own life, but that's not really the human story, is it? The comfort from this story is found in the fact that if you are facing a cross, that you do not need to face this alone. You can build relationships with people who are willing to journey with you through some of the darkest things that life has to offer. Not only that, but if you know a friend who is facing their own cross, it's important for you to acknowledge that they do not need to face this alone. You can be there for them simply by being there for them. And when you consider what the cross is and how Jesus reacted to this and the fact that there were these women who gave him this incredible gift, I think that what Jesus models is how we are to receive an incredible gift of love. And I wish for you this morning is that we may be willing to receive the extravagant love of another's presence when we face our own cross. Sometimes all we can do is say thank you and accept that someone is with us when we are struggling. And when we return to these women, who I find to be so inspiring, my hope is that you and I may have the same faith and the same love as these women when our loved ones face their own cross. That is my hope, that we will be just as loving and courageous as they are. And so, my friends, as you think throughout this week and live throughout this week as we lead up to Resurrection Weekend, my hope and my prayer for you is that you may be loving enough to follow in the footsteps of these incredible women. May we see and embrace Jesus Christ in all, even in the crosses that we face. Amen.